Welcome, everyone. Let's get started with our session, Shifting Cloud Security Left Without Losing Control. This is our fourth episode in the Security as Code webinar series, where we are tackling the challenges of effectively securing public cloud services. As you know, clouds move and change fast, and blink and you could miss something that puts your business at risk. Worse yet, wait to find it in runtime, and you likely have already been breached. Shifting cloud security left seems like an obvious answer, but it's been hard to achieve until now with Security as Code and the focus of today's webinar, Shifting Cloud Security Left Without Losing Control. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. Don Duet, our host for this series, is the chairman and co-founder of Concourse Labs. Don is a widely recognized innovator in cloud security, compliance, and governance. As a global technology leader, he brings a wealth of experience from his 28-year career at Goldman Sachs. And joining Don today is Chris Clark, VP of Products at Concourse. With more than a decade of experience in software development and security operations, Chris oversees, develops, and refines the company's technology and product roadmap. Most recently, Chris was the global lead for Accenture Security, Cyber Defense, and Infrastructure and Security. Now, when you have questions for Don or Chris, you can enter them at any time in using the question button, and they will be taking them at the end of the presentation. Now, I turn it over to Don for today's topic.
Thank you, Mary, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this fourth session of Concourse Connect. Today, as we normally do, I want to start just by redefining or providing a definition of security as code, since I know many of you often wonder what exactly does this mean. And we look at Concourse as security as code as really three fundamental principles. The first is that it's the instantiation of declarative artifacts and controls as code, so it is software. Second, that security as code is the continuous process of formalizing your risk and control objectives and then bringing those to life through converting them into version software. So important to recognize security as code is an ongoing process as the world changes, threats change, or usage of cloud changes, and having that continuously converting into these artifacts that ultimately protect your business. And then third, which is very important as well, is security as code, we believe, follows the basic value proposition of infrastructure as code. So the way that DevOps and infrastructure as code has enabled immutable definitions to achieve scale, to ensure that protection can be moved out of human processes into software processes, that security as code, we believe, very much just follows and stands on the shoulders of the value propositions we've seen through infrastructure as code over many years. So next slide, please, Mary. And some of you may be wondering, why is this necessary? What is the big deal here? Why is this important? We're going to go into a number of aspects around that. But as we kind of look at many companies as they move from historically operating on premise to moving to the public cloud, that we see some very basic and very fundamental changes that occur. First and foremost is just speed of change. So the ability to move to cloud often comes with objectives for innovation and increasing the pace of innovation. It often comes with most of your software development processes moving into an agile process or agile approach to software engineering. And that just means a lot of changes happening a lot faster and much more frequently. So it becomes a physics problem fundamentally of how can you keep up with all these changes? How can you ensure that what you're doing is being done in a way that's safe? Secondly, the fundamental shift into public cloud means that there are just very different risks that operating in a public infrastructure environment without having the ability to have a physical set of firewalls, supporting the multi-dimensions of the security models that will come from different providers. Many of you are working in companies that have not just one cloud provider, but multiple cloud providers in addition to your existing on-premise. That all this complexity adds up and continues to grow. And then lastly, the ability to move that control process from a control plane that was principally your firewall and your DMZ into what becomes a software-defined model that's protecting your applications and your data at a much lower level of granularity is really where the security as code programs become absolutely essential. So we see this shift into security as code being driven by these major factors, but fundamentally, again, becoming a necessary process for companies to operate safely in the hybrid cloud worlds that we all live in today. Next slide, please. So in some of the prior sessions, we've walked through the way that we think about security as code and the establishment of a security as code program, and that we really see there are fundamentally three principal pillars to building and operating a successful security as code program in your organization. It starts with establishment of ownership and accountability through having a well-defined RACI and model for supporting the ability to have role defined within your organization, so you can establish who's responsible for which parts of your control definitions. You can look at the second webinar that we did to learn more about that. We then move on to the ability to ensure that as you're taking those control objectives and actually beginning the process of constructing your software that's going to become your policy as code, that it be done in a way that's actually managed on an enterprise basis, so you can avoid the policy challenges and policy chaos as we described in our third webinar, by having effectively the capability to maintain your content for your security as code independent of your applications and data, and supporting it across its full life cycle, so that as software needs to change and be modified, as your risks change and modify, that all of this can be brought into a continuous and managed process to ensure the integrity ultimately of your security as code program. So I would, for those of you who didn't get a chance, I would definitely recommend go back and, if you can, watch the earlier episodes and learn more about these first two pillars. Today, though, we're going to focus on the third pillar, which is how do you apply these controls comprehensively? And if you could just click once more, Mary, thank you. And for us, this means a couple of different things. One, how do I ensure that I can enforce security guardrails all the way from the build time as I'm developing software through to the actual runtime in the cloud? So how do I ensure that I can build a comprehensive approach that policy can operate at many different aspects of my software lifecycle? Secondly, how do I apply that to all the different cloud services and all the different workloads that I have, including all the different developer experiences and journeys I may have in my company? Third, how do I ensure that we're continuously auditing that control and establishment of both your control posture and then the actual verification of control can be done on a continuous basis and tie back into your regulatory compliance frameworks that you need to operate with? And then lastly, how do we establish a common framework for doing all of this in a way that's scalable, in a way that can deal with the veracity and size of your company and your organization as, an enterprise model for security as code? So next slide, please. And when we think about this whole aspect, today's session on not just how do you integrate your policy and content, but how do you begin that process of shifting left, that it's important to recognize that having a very strong basis of control for what's actually running in your cloud, so looking at what's occurring in your runtime, is absolutely necessary, but it's fundamentally insufficient. Why? Well, because the first and most obvious reason is that it's too late. If you have defects in your cloud, in the runtime, you're already exposed to potential issues. The ability to both recognize those gaps as well as to remediate them could take time. That further adds to the risk surface, the risk area that you're at, where you're exposed potentially to threats. And the world we live in, unfortunately, as I think we've all seen, is just, there are many compromises and issues that are happening at a very, very fast rate. And so the ability to reduce fundamentally the aperture for control and risk means that we need to shift into further upstream from the actual runtime to how we actually construct, build, and then deploy solutions into the cloud itself. So if you could click next, thank you. So as we go into this session, what we're really going to be talking about is how do we take the content that we've talked about in the prior episodes, where we're actually building and maintaining that enterprise view of policy as code, ensuring that it has the integrity behind it, and now thinking about how do we inject or bring that into ultimately our developer journeys. And we know that in many enterprises that we work with, and I'm sure in many of you on this call today, the important thing here is that there's a lot of diversity in developer journeys. Some companies have gotten very advanced with their CI/CD process, but almost always there's no one pipeline to solve all. For many companies, getting to a true DevOps CI/CD model is still aspirational versus the reality of where many of their workloads and data are being managed. And so really kind of thinking comprehensively about this process, both how do we provide the ability to bring ultimately policy and control as close as possible to where decisions are being made and events are occurring, requires us to consider going not just into the CI/CD processes where they are available and introspecting as cloud assets are being deployed to the cloud itself to ensure that we can determine whether there are issues or defects and validate them before they're even released, but also even deeper into the actual SCM, the software change management processes. So as code is being committed, as developers are making changes or building artifacts, that we can introspect and provide policy at that level as well. So the ability to shift left is ultimately the best practice that can really bolster having the capabilities to ensure that whatever is in your runtime is correct in reducing the likelihood of risk and value. It also has been very important in helping with education. So as we know, kind of helping people become more aware and understanding of best practices for security is an ongoing and continuous process, bringing ultimately the controls directly to the development teams and to the DevOps groups further helps kind of increase the ability and awareness around security, which ultimately helps design and deliver a more safe and secure workforce. Having said that, what we've seen a lot has been that unfortunately that shift left, in part because of the complexity and the diversity of many development experiences, has been a challenge in many organizations. What we think we do at Concourse, which is very important in helping mitigate that, is really break the problem into two spaces. One, how do I build and manage all the control content itself and get that into a place where it can be maintained at an enterprise level? And then secondly, how do I now bring that to all these different journeys? How do I get that integrated as deeply as I can in different places, recognizing the complexity that's there is an incredibly important part of that process. So I'm going to hand off to Chris to talk about how we actually do it and how this all works together. But this ability to kind of think about controls and content independently at an enterprise level and then inject it ultimately into many different aspects of your development experiences, your deployment experiences, and of course, your runtime, which we don't want to forget, that collectively helps us really build and integrate and deliver a very comprehensive security as code program. Chris, I'll hand it to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Don. I appreciate it. So I'm going to spend the rest of this presentation. We're going to be talking a little bit about the Concourse way, the way that we're attempting to solve exactly the problems that Don's put out there. And we'll start from the top, really. And if you notice up at the top of both the slide and the top of where everyone's concerns are, there's really a big bifurcation. You've got the logical side, which is sort of all of the build time data, all of the source code management. And then you've got the physical side, so driving things over into the cloud, the runtime detection and response. As we talked about a little bit earlier, you've got a critical need to cover both of these and to tie them together to ensure that you've got holistic coverage for your organization. A good portion of where the challenges arise for businesses right now is translating legacy policy, which is not necessarily specific to either runtime or build time, into something that can be applied both dynamically and can be applied specifically enough to different locations within the business to not be cumbersome, to not get in the way of all those developer journeys that Don really talked about a little bit earlier, where everyone's going to have a little bit of a different way to go about doing so. Another key element of what we're attempting to accomplish here across every stage of SDLC is to create visibility and to ensure that not just the development and platform team have visibility into all of these issues, but the security teams also feel comfortable with delegating some of this control responsibility down to the engineers, down to the developers, so that they can execute with fewer road bumps and get a lot of that velocity back that's currently lost to some of the compliance and security control elements right now. So if Mary, if you could play the next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about the Concourse platform. I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the platform writ large, so we'll start a little bit basic and talk about what we're here to do. Fundamentally, Concourse is a SaaS application or multi-tenant SaaS application that serves in the cloud as a clearinghouse for security policy. Not just your own, but we can also publish and share and ensure that you'll be able to benefit from all of the customers that we have inside the Concourse platform, as well as best practices that we're able to integrate and internalize, both from standards and from our own security research team as they dig down different areas as the cloud consistently shifts. So the journey for a security engineer and the journey for any user of the Concourse starts with the creation of policy. That can happen either from the internalization of existing policy or building things that are brand new to best practices on top of the shifting sands that are the cloud. And a lot of what we do is try to simplify that and make it easy. The next step in is, in order to have that work, you have to be able to apply it to something, right? So we'll dynamically identify inventory in the cloud for you, in the runtime inventory, and then also similarly on the build time side, so that we know both where the logical side and the physical side connect, and enable you to apply that policy in a hierarchical fashion in a tool that we call surfaces within the Concourse platform. Once the policy is applied to a specific area, the evaluation engine, and there's different ones for runtime and build time, will occur, and then you'll follow a normal security product pipeline, which is, you'll see detections, you'll see alerting, and then you'll be able to iterate and then really be able to drive that policy lifecycle management that Don talked about earlier. We also integrate holistically with a number of workflow tools in order to both solve for the security user, security work side workflow, such as SIMs and the rest, as well as the development work side, going into Jira, going to ticketing tools, et cetera. And we'll show that a little bit later. So next slide, please, Mary. So once you've got all of your policy set up and you've got it and implemented in such a way that it's aligning with the needs of your business, as well as with the specifics of the projects and programs that you're leveraging the cloud to deploy. One of the first elements that you can use the Concourse platform to interdict threats and violations with is inside the source code management tool, or source code management system generally. Now, one of the things that we try to pride ourselves on here at Concourse, and Don sort of touched on this, is a lot of organizations really want to shift left completely, but not a lot of them are mature enough per se in a lot of their processes to be able to make that a one-stop jump, right? So a lot of what we're trying to do is ensure that an organization that might just be using normative IDs and just basic source code management and deployment is capable of getting the exact same amount of protection and the exact same visibility into their logical deployments and physical deployments as someone who has a more mature CI/CD pipeline and can automate away a lot of this. So when you have a developer, we have something that's relatively basic. This is a relatively simplistic Concourse implementation, whereby as the user's typing in code, implementing what he wants to do and creating a pull or merge request, asynchronously, we'll be able to identify, scan that code, and be able to stop, if desired, either stop a request or inform the developer of what the issue is, and also provide a remediation instruction as well. And so in addition to that occurring on the developer side, out of band from that, you'll notice up top the ticketing and workflow system, provided that an organization wants to see. We provide audit records of all of these activities. We can also provide violation records. We can provide information around the specifics of the violation in the source code, or the specifics of the policy, either to the security team or to the platform team, who have different needs and different desires. So next slide, Mary. Thank you very much. So moving on, now what you're looking at on the screen is a slightly more mature organization, right? We want to be able to make sure that we can satiate all customers. And in this case, it may be that we start initially and we either grow with the organization, or we just, in this case, potentially walking into a more mature company that has a good number of integration points where we might be able to layer in security, right? And that's the case here. We're able to use our plugin. In this example, we're going to be using a Bitbucket plugin so that we can begin to do more robust pipeline integrations, both for alerting, both for pass fail, and also to ensure that it's an inescapable element of the CI/CD pipeline. But the process that overlays that is identical. So you'll still be able, all the data and all of the metadata that we gain from our analysis will be pulled up into our data lake. We'll provide analytics on top of that and feed outbound into a ticketing and workflow system, the relevant bits for the specific team that we're solving for. Next one, Mary. Thank you. So now, as Don mentioned, it's incredibly important that we don't underplay the importance of runtime monitoring and runtime detection and remediation. In almost all instances, we're going to be in a position where we want to make sure that we're using the runtime data as a baseline. We also want to be able to understand and draw linkages between the two. We can identify a ton of information, not even necessarily from policy violations, just from being able to inventory and show our organizations and our users where and how their assets in the clouds are operating, right? And ultimately, as they mature, they continue along the journey with Concourse, we can start to layer in and ensure that we've got policy coverage, and we're operating inside of the guardrails that we placed out there through our security as code foundations. And insofar as the follow-on ticketing and violations workflow, once more, all of that data folds into our data lake, and we're able to then optimize and stream that out as necessary for further actions. Next slide, please. This is a brief example, just identifying exactly how granular we're able to apply policies. One of the major issues that we're attempting to solve here at Concourse is that the legacy policy is not a dynamic, and it's not a programmatic element, right? So you've got a PDF that someone has sitting in the security. You're trying to interpret it. You're doing your very best to identify when and where that should be applied to your code, your program. And then sometimes, hey, something gets closed on you, et cetera, right? And what we're trying to do here is both pull that policy into something that can be applied programmatically and provide absolute transparency to both the engineer and the developer, as well as to the security team, on where the policy is being applied, and more importantly, almost, where it's not being applied. So where there's a designed exception, we like to call them designed exceptions, rather than the old way of doing things where you just had a big black hole where things were going on that didn't fit the mold. Now we can hierarchically apply policies. So here's a global policy, like encryption for everybody, but at the level here, in this case, Asia's highlighted, there may be a different set of policies that are acceptable and are approved, but differ from the global side, right? And we're able to use both of those, and both do so in the build time side, previous to being implemented, and then also monitor and detect for drift in the runtime side of the game. So next slide, please, Mary. So you'll see here, this is an example of what we were mentioning earlier, showing earlier with the CI/CD pipelines and SCM. So, this is our Bitbucket plugin. Once this is operable, you're simply going to be able to receive directly within the Concourse application, directly within Bitbucket in the comments, and or also if you're leveraging layered on tools such as a Splunk or whatnot, to be able to manage both security and operational workflows, you'll be able to get notifications in there as well that align up to your policy, and then ultimately allow the security, policy, and engineering teams to modify those policies in order to make sure that they both fit the security needs and also the production business needs of your organization and your program. Next slide, please. This is just a little bit deeper view into what a developer might see as they're operating with the Concourse Lab tool. You'll notice here, this is showing true and false for some variants. And, in real time, as you modify policies, as you tune them, you'll be able to see deltas occur, both, again, within real-time asynchronous callbacks for the engineers, but also on the far side for both the security teams and for the overall management from the CIO side. Next slide, please. So, that's in a nutshell, the Concourse way. Some of the key pieces to take away from this, we want to make sure that we're taking a policy that was previously a rigid document and ensuring that it's able to sit very nicely on top of both the logical build time and the runtime side, and then bridge that gap together so that you arrive at a holistic coverage in such a way that it doesn't block developer effort, right? We want to enable that. And one of the other pieces that we want to point on here is that we're able to, in a mature organization, not everyone wants to do this or needs to, but we're able to interdict at various different points, providing security and depth across the CI/CD pipeline. And then also at the far side of that, for existing tools, existing things that are running, a lot of organizations have, runtime stuff that isn't necessarily tied to pipelines in any way, but we still want to be able to layer over it the same security controls so that we can gain visibility and ultimately remediate. And then, the last 2 points here, it's very important to understand that from the core, what we're trying to do is democratize security responsibility and democratize the capability to change policy, and most importantly, to be accountable for it, right? So the security teams can still maintain their perspective and their ownership of the higher order policies of critical nature. And then the engineering product teams with Concourse Labs can be made to be responsible for project-specific policies that might have some variance in between each one, right? So the engineers are able to automatically take care of that and also be able to progress forward without necessarily having to ask for questions, having to ask for permission or exceptions to the rules that might plague or might plague some of the organizations that are developing within larger organizations, larger companies. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll turn it back over to Don, and let's like to say a couple final words.